are short on time, so we'll pass the mic on to Sean Surdovel, who will share with us everything we need to know about content that converts on our discovery campaigns. Sean, the mic is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. As far as running a content campaign that converts with Taboola, we have a few best practices that we want to go over today with that regard. First and foremost, we want to introduce you to the Taboola user so that you know exactly who it is you're engaging with on Taboola. Second, we're going to go over kind of some common content strategies for performance marketers and how to tailor that approach to your audience and your product. Then we'll go over some best practices for crafting titles, go over some best practices regarding calls to action on your landing pages, and go over some techniques for A/B testing on Taboola as well. As far as our user goes, it's a little bit different from audiences that you may be used to engaging with across search and social networks. On search, people are very intent-driven. They're specifically searching out specific keywords, and so they are seeking you out, if not by name, then by keyword as well. On social, there's a measure of intent because these are very often people you're connected to or who connect to you through their friends and other people that are engaging with your content. What makes Taboola unique is that they are really self-selecting into your message just on the basis of finding you, in most cases, at the end of the article. It's a user who is in a discovery-driven mindset and what we sometimes refer to as falling down the internet wormhole, mostly engaging with content in their free time, purely for the sake of enjoyment. So there are a few things that you should know about this user. Number one is that they've not directly sought out your product and they're kind of flying blind. And because of that, they're not really in decision-making mode. Every action they take on Taboola, though they do self-select in, is one that they were not expecting to make today. That's the thing, though, is you've reached an audience that would not have found otherwise. And oftentimes our advertisers do report that new uniques from Taboola are much higher than what they're getting through other channels. You also have a captive audience for your pitch, whatever the product may be, as this is someone who's self-selected into your message and therefore is interested in learning more about what you have to say. So your goal with that user is to reach and engage them, guide them to your KPI, whatever that may be, and then whatever action you're asking the user to take, make it easy for them to do so. It's all part of what we call the Great Online Balancing Act, generating high click-through rate so that your ads will show more often and will be prominent on Taboola's network, while also being engaging with regards to your KPI and getting people to take the action that ultimately is going to drive value for you, the advertiser. So how do we make your content perform? Well, let's start off with an example. You have to know your product and the audience that's reaching your product. And one example that we speak to very often is an early example from our creative strategy team of an online dating advertiser who, when they started with Taboola, were running the article 10 Tips to Impress on a First Date. Now, this is actually a really great engaging piece of content, and they were getting a lot of traction on our network from this article. Problem is, they weren't generating a lot of signups for their service. So we spoke to them and we started to get into the nitty-gritty of how they crafted their content and realized that people who were looking at 10 tips to impress on a first date are people who already have a first date to go on. So we instead recommended that they try 8 reasons to try online dating. And quite frankly, almost got laughed out of the room because it's something so basic and so obvious that most content writers don't really want to put that out there. But they tried it and the results were instantaneous. We had a 5x improvement in conversion rate and they started hitting their CPA goal right away. The difference is simple. By giving 8 reasons to try online dating, you're speaking to someone who knows online dating is out there, has maybe already considered it, and is in the process of making a decision whether to do it themselves or not. Where someone who is looking for tips to impress on a first date has a more thriving dating life and doesn't really need to try online dating. So to that end, how do you pick the right strategy for your product? Well, there are 3 common user actions that we see across Taboola. Number one is what we call the no risk decision. It's basically asking for just a little bit of information, maybe an email or a zip code, something to get the user started and really just introduce them to your product, mostly generating leads for nurture campaigns or for other projects. Very common on our network, very successful on our network. And it works because there's very low risk. Even if the user is discovering you for the first time, there's not much risk to just leaving their email or the zip code. That's stuff that isn't really too personally identifiable, isn't too dangerous to share with anyone else. And so they feel comfortable leaving that with someone they just discovered on the internet. Second is what we call the low risk transaction. And this is really any time someone has to put out any personally identifiable information that is sensitive. Say, for example, if this was asking if your product had to ask for some reason for a social security number or something like that, or anytime someone has to give a credit card number, whether they have to pay money up front or whether it's for a free trial where they have to put in a credit card. That is a riskier transaction for a user to take. And so they tend to take a little bit more time to actually make that decision. In fact, most transactions that require a credit card across Taboola's network, the average time to convert is 3 to 4 days. The third is the high risk transaction. And this is any action that requires discussing with someone else, requires meticulous planning, or requires precise timing. Now, most people, when they think of high risk, they think of the buyer's remorse type decisions, buying a new TV or buying a couch or a car, something that we know is going to be a big commitment to buy into. But this can also be smaller transactions as well. Something as simple as ordering a pizza, for example, requires precise timing in the sense that it has to be a mealtime and you have to be hungry. And you have to coordinate with someone else to eat a whole pizza, unless you're a particularly hungry individual. But that is a good example of a high-risk transaction that does not actually cost a lot of money, but nonetheless requires a specific set of circumstances to be present in order for the user to make that decision. Now, what are some common considerations to make in regards to your campaign strategy? Number one is to make sure that you're providing value to the user. Always explain what makes your product interesting and useful and how that benefits the consumer. Number two is to add credibility. Oftentimes testimonials can be a great way to illustrate the value of your product. A lot of other ways that Taboola users or Taboola advertisers create credibility for their product is by promoting earned media or things that other people have said about their product as well. And that can be a great way to make you appear trustworthy to a consumer. Number three is you want to make sure you keep your action easy to identify and easy to accomplish. Taboola users, as I said before, are more or less falling down an internet wormhole, so we don't want to make them work. We want to make sure that whatever action we're asking them to take is something that feels natural and normal and feels like they can easily do it. If they have to work to find where they take the next step, then they're probably going to bounce before they actually take it. Number four is to make sure you plan for the user's decision-making process. First-time users or a familiar user, they will interact very differently with your content depending upon how far in the decision process they are and whether they've discovered you before. So someone, for example, who maybe is looking at booking an airline flight will not do so without having done some prior research first and maybe already aware of your client, whereas a first-time user, someone who is coming across an airline for the first time is going to take some time to research and is going to take some time to plan out with people around them as to whether or not this is something that they need to make a decision on. Also make sure to plan for any secondary KPIs. If there are ways to continue engaging with your users, make sure to put those in there as well. And we'll talk a little bit later on about how to position those on your page to make the best use of our audience. And also if there's any retargeting or anything you have to do with the user as well. Again, factor in what the user's decision-making process is for whatever product or whatever service you're looking to promote across Taboola's network. And is someone who's engaging with you or discovering you for the first time likely to make that decision? And if not, how do we continue to engage with them? Continuing on, you want to make sure you speak to your audience at a point where they're most likely to convert. Again, this speaks to that person who maybe is buying airline tickets, speaking to them at the point where they've already made a decision as to where they want to go and now maybe just need a good flight deal, is a good way to actually drive conversions there. And number two, always have a backup plan. So for example, if you're doing lead generation for a client or something along those lines, relying not just on an end of article call to action to drive conversions, but maybe also relying on a 15 to 20 second delayed pop-up or a pop-up that comes up when the user actually reaches for the X on their screen can be a good way to make sure that you have other irons in the fire to get the user's attention and to get them to take the action that you want them to take. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about titles, because this is really your first and best targeting tool on Taboola's network. It's important that whatever products you're promoting, that we drive quality users to help drive conversions. You want to be enticing, but you also want to be specific to your product and to its benefits. A good example of this is diaper ads. A lot of times what marketers will do for diapers is they will target their ads towards a specific audience, women 25 to 38 who are most likely to have children. But that misses a lot of other people who are maybe buying diapers as well, grandmothers who are babysitting for a day, or fathers who are picking up diapers on their way home from work. If you actually speak directly to people about diapers, you're probably more likely to drive a conversion and likely to convert across a wider audience than you would if you just had a campaign targeted specifically to married women 25 to 38. Some other tips for attracting users are to entice them with intrigue and mystery. It's important that users feel like there's some need to complete an action in order to click onward, and actually completing an idea and learning about something that was left out by clicking through is a powerful way to drive engagement on Taboola's network. So make sure that whenever you're promoting a message, without being too clickbaity and misleading the user, because we never want to mislead the user and set them up for expectations that are not going to be met on the other side of the click, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We do want to make sure that there is some piece of information they're missing that causes them to click through and go to the next page in your funnel. Numbered lists are also a great way to get attention on Taboola's network. There's a reason that BuzzFeed has become the huge behemoth of the online content world as it has, and it's that listicle, snackable content is something that's very easy for users to identify with, especially for Taboola users who, again, tend to be in a more laid-back, entertainment-driven mindset. Giving them an expectation of what to see on the other side and something that's easily consumed can be a great way to drive them through to your page and keep them there and keep them engaged once they're there. Oops, forward too far. But the last important thing to remember for your headlines is to use bold descriptive words, saying something is literally free money or the most comfortable jeans you'll ever wear are powerful messages because they do extend a bit of hyperbole and kind of amp the user's expectations up a little bit. That can help to drive the user in. Well, I really want to see what this is all about, or I really want to know what this is. It can really help amp up that aura of mystery that you cultivated by leaving a piece of information out, and help to drive them to actually click to your page. Again, meeting user expectations is crucial. This is something that, regardless of your content strategy, you want to make sure that when the user lands on the other side, they knew what they were getting themselves into. If, for example, you promote an article that says 7 reasons we think the zombie apocalypse is nigh, you want to make sure to give them 7 reasons the zombie apocalypse is going to happen, as opposed to maybe a promo for the upcoming episode of The Walking Dead or a link to the government's zombie apocalypse preparedness document. Meeting their expectations and showing them what they expected to see is very important. And this pertains to content types as well. So if, for example, you're promoting a white paper for a B2B lead capture campaign, or if you're promoting a video, for example, you want to set those expectations up front in your headline so that the user knows what they're getting when they click through to the next page. As far as call to actions go, it's important that you give the user some context, because you have to remember that this user is not intent driven. They haven't arrived from search and they didn't come from your homepage. They came from Taboola, and most likely they came from an article that didn't have much to do with your product. So it's important to give them some reason to take action if you want them to do so. Make sure that you give a compelling reason, even if it's just a few sentences. Give them a compelling reason to sign up for your product and to take whatever action you need them to take, because that will be important to actually getting them to go there. As far as how you drive towards your KPI, the bottom of the article space is the prime real estate. And this is really where Taboola has, kind of proved and grown as business, is our placements for the most part at the end of article. So if you get down to the end of the page, you know that this is a user who engaged with a Taboola widget and found you at the end of an article to begin with. So you want to make the best use of your end of article space in order to drive actions from that user. This is actually an example from Taboola's blog. You can see here that this is the first action that we want them to take, is we want them to download a free content discovery guide. And we've provided that call to action immediately at the end of content because that's the next thing we want them to do. We do have a secondary KPI, obviously, to get them to click on links to other content within the Taboola network. So we've placed that below our primary KPI. It's important that if you do have more than one KPI for users, that you do prioritize them at the end of article in this way. If you put your secondary KPI first, that's probably the thing that's most likely going to drive the most action. So putting the primary first ensures that that's the thing that users are most likely to do, and the secondary is the thing that they're second most likely to do. Some things you don't want to do with regards to your call to action is you don't want to keep it in the right rail. Taboola users do tend to ignore right rail call to actions and focus more on the content that's in the middle of the page. Again, these are people who are in a more laid back, discovery-oriented mode, and they're not really looking to take any action. So they're not really looking for actions to take, and they're not going to seek things out in the right rail. They want to see things that are in the content itself. So make sure not to bury your calls to action in the right rail of your page. Another thing you want to avoid is making your call to action look like a banner. I actually was discussing with someone earlier today, and they did the research that says you're actually more likely to survive a plane crash than you are to click on a banner ad. I would Google that to verify it, but I've heard it used a couple times. And this really holds true for Taboola users. They do not click on banner ads. So if you make your call to action look like a banner ad, even if it's in the prime real estate at the end of your article, it's less likely to drive engagement just because it's something that Taboola users are used to ignoring. Best practice is generally to do a hyperlink, as you saw on our example a few slides back, or to do maybe a centered button just below your content as well. A/B test that. A/B testing is an important part of success on Taboola. And it's important to remember that, this is all about making sure that the user is not working for you. So making the call to action as easy as you possibly can to find, and making it as easy to take and to make that decision you possibly can is important. When possible, automatic integrations like Facebook Connect and PayPal can go a long way towards making a difference as well. So to the point of A/B testing, obviously that's something that you want to continue doing throughout the length of your campaign. This is one example where we worked with a client to promote a singular piece of content that actually related to both George Clooney and Abraham Lincoln. Given that a lot of engagement on our network comes from celebrity-related content, we were actually expecting that the George Clooney item was going to do much, much better than the Abraham Lincoln item because there tend to be fewer history buffs on Taboola, unfortunately. But we expected that George Clooney would do really well, but nonetheless ran an A/B test with this. Turns out that the Abraham Lincoln item had over 300 times higher click-through rate. And the big reason for this actually comes down to the image that these headlines were paired with. The Abraham Lincoln item was paired with a photo of Abraham Lincoln. So when we said you won't believe who's related to Abraham Lincoln, there was no answer immediately apparent in the ad. The George Clooney item was paired with the exact same image. So when someone looks at that ad, they immediately know that George Clooney is related to Abraham Lincoln. The only thing they're missing is how, and if you're not so interested in George Clooney's life, you're probably not going to click through to figure out how he's related to Abe Lincoln. Another important thing to A/B test is your landing page layouts. This is another example where we ran an A/B test with a client just on a basic page layout. You see, the only real difference here is the bolded subheaders on the page itself. Otherwise, the content is entirely the same, and the call to action is pretty much the same as well. So with the difference in adding these bolded subheaders throughout the page to make it easier to consume, we actually saw that there was a 57% uplift in conversion rate in the second version of the page. Reason being is this actually made it easier on the user to consume the page, not just to read, but to actually skim and know where they were going with this content, and eventually lead them to the exact same call to action at the end of the page. So it's important that you A/B test these things, because that will help you determine what the best approach for your product is. So that concludes my end. I'm going to turn things back over to Jonathan. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. And we have one question from the audience. In regards to headline best practices, do you have any recommendations between direct response and branding ads?
So I think there's always a line to toe there. The important thing ultimately comes down to where your marketing dollars are best spent. If you have a client who is happy spending dollars on a branding